Hi everyone, welcome back to Truth in Shadows. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Today's story is almost unbelievable. A daughter disappears for 24 years, and the person behind it was living just upstairs. What was hidden beneath a quiet home in Elm Ridge, Pennsylvania? And how did one man keep such a terrible secret for so long? If this case interests you, please like, share, and subscribe to help us keep bringing more true crime stories to light. Let's begin. It was a humid August afternoon in 1984 when everything changed for the Bell family. The town of Elm Ridge, nestled quietly in rural Pennsylvania, had never seen much drama. It was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors borrowed sugar without knocking. But all of that serenity cracked the moment 18-year-old Claire Bell vanished without a trace. Claire was in many ways like any other teenage girl. She had dreams of leaving Elm Ridge, of attending college in the city, of becoming a teacher or maybe a writer. Her notebooks were filled with poetry, journal entries, and short stories she kept hidden under her mattress. At school, she wasn't the most popular, but she had close friends and teachers who admired her thoughtfulness and curiosity. She had a quiet charm, a softness that drew people in. She helped her mother in the kitchen, took walks alone in the nearby woods, and spent hours sketching and reading. She was someone people noticed, not because she was loud, but because she looked like she was always deep in thought, as if she carried some private world no one else could see. That's why when she disappeared, it didn't feel like the kind of teenage rebellion people see in movies. There was no warning, no signs of trouble. Claire didn't have a boyfriend she was planning to run away with, didn't leave angry letters, and hadn't packed a bag. Her clothes were still in her closet. Her shoes were still by the front door. But her father, Arthur Bell, seemed to have an explanation ready before anyone could even ask. Arthur, a 49-year-old retired electrical engineer, called the police that very evening. He told them Claire had left a note, handwritten, he said, explaining that she had decided to join a religious group that was traveling through the region. She didn't want to be found. She needed distance from her old life. A spiritual awakening. A fresh start. Arthur's story was strangely detailed. He explained that Claire had been distant lately, reflective, and that she had spoken once or twice about feeling out of place in Elm Ridge. According to him, she had mentioned the group weeks earlier but never gave much detail. The note, Arthur claimed, was proof of her intent. A clear goodbye. The police took the letter, read it, and found nothing obviously suspicious. It was signed with Claire's name. The handwriting was shaky, but still resembled hers. There was no indication of foul play. No forced entry, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle. Claire's room was neat. The bed sheets were smooth. The house was silent. The officer in charge noted in his report that Arthur appeared composed and forthcoming. He answered questions patiently, never raised his voice, and even offered them coffee. He wore a gray sweater vest despite the heat and sat with his legs neatly crossed as if they were discussing an overdue tax bill, not the disappearance of his only daughter. Margaret Bell, on the other hand, was devastated. Her eyes were red and swollen. She seemed confused, unsure how to react. Her voice shook when she told the officers that Claire would never leave without saying goodbye to her. "We were close," she said. "She told me everything. Or I thought she did." But Margaret didn't push back against Arthur's version of events. Maybe she didn't want to believe anything worse. Maybe the idea of Claire being out there, somewhere, seeking peace, was easier than the alternative. She accepted the story with hesitant silence. Her grief stayed quiet, folding into the walls of the house. Friends of Claire were stunned. No one had heard her talk about religion, much less joining a group. Her best friend, Rachel, told local news, Claire wasn't like that. She wasn't impulsive. She wouldn't just leave. But in a town like Elm Ridge, people didn't ask too many questions. If the police said it wasn't a crime, then maybe it wasn't. The weeks passed. No phone call. No letter. No visits. Arthur told people that Claire had chosen her path and that they should respect her privacy. He never seemed worried. When neighbors asked if he'd heard from her, he'd shrug slightly, as if he had already accepted her choice. She needed something different, he would say. She wanted to find herself. After a while, people stopped asking. The posters on telephone poles faded under rain. Claire's photo in the local paper was replaced by stories about harvest festivals and school fundraisers. The world kept turning, as it always does. Inside the Bell home, things returned to a strange kind of normal. Margaret started baking again. Arthur spent time in his basement workshop. From the outside, it seemed as if the family was healing. But the truth was that they were just surviving. And beneath their home, hidden from view, was a door no one else knew about. A door that led to the truth. Behind that door was silence. Darkness. And Claire Bell. She hadn't gone anywhere. She hadn't run away. She hadn't written a letter. She had never left. Arthur Bell was not a man who did things without purpose. He was meticulous in everything, his clothes always neatly pressed, tools arranged with exact symmetry, and routines that rarely changed by the minute. People in Elm Ridge saw him as quiet, intelligent, and somewhat distant, a retired electrical engineer who spent more time in his basement than anywhere else. He didn't drink, didn't attend community gatherings, and never raised his voice. But beneath the surface, Arthur was quietly constructing something that defied understanding. It began in late 1981. The Cold War had people on edge, and talk of nuclear conflict occasionally made the rounds in newspapers and evening news broadcasts. Arthur used this as a justification when neighbors casually asked what he was working on. A shelter, he would say. Just in case. To the average person, the idea didn't sound unreasonable. Other homes in the area had storm cellars or modest basements. But Arthur's project quickly surpassed anything that could be called standard. For weeks, the sound of hammering and drilling echoed from beneath his home. Hardware deliveries became frequent. Large quantities of concrete, steel beams, water tanks, and electrical components arrived with little explanation. No one thought to question it. He told the hardware store owner he was building a safe room - just a precaution, he repeated. What he was building was not for safety. It was for silence. A soundproof space, deeply hidden, impossible to access without exact knowledge of its structure. He worked alone, never hiring help, moving slowly but steadily. He was methodical. Walls were reinforced with thick layers of concrete, lined with lead, and sealed with industrial insulation. The floors were raised to allow for a hidden wiring system. Ventilation ducts were buried and muffled. Lights were set on a switch that only he could access. Every feature of the space was designed for long-term containment, not survival in a disaster, but the controlled existence of a person who would never be allowed to leave. He installed a steel door at the far end of his workshop. To anyone who entered, it looked like a wall painted to match, no handle, flush against the foundation. Only Arthur knew the sequence of actions to open it: a hidden panel behind a shelf, a keypad installed beneath the workbench, and a physical lever inside the wall. Behind that door was a narrow hallway, just wide enough for a person to pass through without touching the sides. It led to a small chamber that branched into two low-ceilinged rooms, each without windows, with walls painted in dull, beige tones. The air felt dry, processed through recycled vents. The silence was oppressive. No echo, no birdsong, not even the creak of the house above. One room was fitted with a mattress on a metal frame, a sink, and a bucket toilet in the corner. The other had shelves, an old desk, and supplies: canned food, blankets, water jugs, a small electric heater. There were no decorations, no clocks, no mirrors. Time would pass in this place without evidence. Arthur visited the chamber every day under the guise of working on electrical projects. He brought down tools, tested switches, measured airflow, calculated how many days of food could be stored without spoilage. He adjusted the lighting so it never mimicked natural sunlight, avoiding any link to the passage of day or night. He did not consider comfort. He calculated endurance. He was not preparing for disaster. He was preparing for control. During these years, Arthur rarely mentioned Claire. When he did, he spoke as if she were becoming difficult. "She doesn't understand the world," he once told a neighbor. Teenagers these days, so emotional. He planted quiet seeds that might explain her later disappearance. In his mind, the pieces were already falling into place. What no one saw, not even Margaret, was the shift in Arthur's gaze when he looked at Claire. It wasn't paternal warmth. It was fixation. He studied her habits when she woke, how long she spent brushing her hair, what books she read, the way she bit her fingernail when nervous. He listened outside her bedroom door, memorized her footsteps. He was not just preparing a space. He was preparing to own someone. He had long buried beliefs, thoughts he never shared, not even with his wife. He believed women were made to follow. That daughters, especially, were the property of their fathers. That love and obedience were not separate things. In his worldview, Claire had no life apart from him. She did not need friends, school, or independence. Those things were distractions. He believed he could give her everything she needed: food, warmth, guidance. What others called abuse, he saw as purpose. By early 1984, the space was finished. It was functional, hidden, and completely under his control. Now all he needed was the moment. That summer, Claire had finished high school and had begun to talk about college. She wanted to apply to a school in another state, maybe study literature. Arthur discouraged it. He called it a waste of money, an illusion. "There's nothing out there you can't learn here," he told her. Claire didn't argue, but she didn't stop dreaming either. She read more. She began writing a personal journal, pages Arthur would later find and burn. On August 14th, the day was hot and still. Margaret had gone to visit her sister 2 towns over. Arthur was alone with Claire. He waited until late afternoon, then called to her from the basement. "Claire," he said. "I need your help. Something's wrong with the fuse box." Claire hesitated. She never liked the basement. It always felt cold and wrong to her. But she followed, unaware that everything in her life was about to change. She stepped into the workshop. Arthur was waiting, calm as ever. He asked her to check something near the back wall. She walked toward the false panel, bent slightly to examine the wires, and that was when he moved. He pressed a switch. The panel slid open. Before she could react, he pushed her forward, through the narrow passage. The steel door closed behind her with a deep, final sound. She screamed. She pounded the door. She called his name again and again. Arthur said nothing. He stood on the other side of the wall and listened until her voice became hoarse. Then he turned off the hallway light, walked back upstairs, and made himself a cup of tea. That night, he slept peacefully. The next morning, he wrote the letter. He spent nearly 2 hours getting the handwriting right, copying from old notes Claire had written. He folded the page neatly and tucked it into an envelope. Then he called the police. The chamber beneath the Bell family's home was not built for comfort. Its walls were made of thick, gray concrete that absorbed every sound. There were no windows, no fresh air, and no signs of the outside world. Time did not pass naturally there. It dragged in stillness, hour after hour, day after day. The fluorescent ceiling lights buzzed faintly when switched on, casting a cold, sterile glow across the tiny space. In that suffocating silence, Claire Bell awoke every morning not knowing what hour it was, not knowing what day it had become. The first few weeks were a storm of desperation. Claire yelled, cried, banged on the steel door until her knuckles bruised. She screamed until her throat burned, her voice cracked and weakened. She tried reasoning, pleading, bargaining with Arthur, calling out to the man who was supposed to protect her. But Arthur never answered through the door. He only came when it suited him, bringing food on a set schedule known only to himself. He never acknowledged her questions. He never offered explanations. His silence became another wall. At first, Claire thought maybe someone would notice. A neighbor might suspect something. Her mother would sense something was wrong. But the days turned to weeks, and no help came. Slowly, the hope that had kept her standing began to thin like mist. Arthur maintained a strict routine. He came down through the hidden hallway only at precise times. He brought meals, simple food that could be stored for long periods. Canned soup, crackers, powdered milk, boiled eggs. Always enough to survive, never enough for comfort. If Claire cried, he told her to be quiet. If she asked a question, he ignored it. If she disobeyed his unspoken rules, he turned the lights off for hours. He monitored her without emotion, sometimes staying longer to observe, other times speaking in a calm, instructional tone. He would bring her books, old encyclopedias, religious texts, outdated first aid manuals. Occasionally, he would leave her puzzles, or simple math worksheets. It wasn't kindness. It was control. He shaped her reality piece by piece, stripping away the outside world and replacing it with one where only he held knowledge and power. Months passed. Then years. Sometime in late 1985, Claire realized she was pregnant. The shock was numbing. She had no one to ask, no one to help, no one to even say the words aloud to. Arthur, without ceremony, brought down a stained medical book and a few supplies: towels, plastic sheets, rubbing alcohol. He said nothing. There was no apology, no guilt. Just quiet instructions, written in old pages. When the baby came, Claire was alone. The pain was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She bit down on a piece of cloth to muffle her screams, terrified of what Arthur might do if she disturbed his peace. After hours of struggle, she delivered the child, her hands shaking, her body soaked in sweat and fear. She wrapped the infant in one of the few blankets she had and held it against her chest, sobbing not from joy, but from a mix of terror and love. Arthur arrived hours later. He glanced at the child and said only, "It'll stay." The infant, her son, became her lifeline. She named him Thomas, after a character from one of her favorite books. He had soft, dark hair and delicate hands that gripped her finger tightly. She held him constantly, whispered to him, sang lullabies she remembered from her childhood. She created a rhythm within the unchanging darkness, feeding, rocking, comforting. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to purpose. 2 years later, another baby came. Then another. Some of the children stayed underground with her. Others, when they reached a certain age, were taken. Arthur never told her why. He would arrive one morning, look at the child, and decide. Claire would beg, clutch the baby in her arms, plead with him not to take them. But Arthur's mind was made of stone. He would pry the child away, sometimes gently, sometimes not. And the next day, there would be silence where a laugh used to be. She didn't know where he took them. She feared the worst. But Arthur, in his own twisted sense of structure, had a plan. He left them on the family's doorstep with forged notes written in handwriting made to resemble Claire's, explaining that she couldn't care for them anymore. That she was giving them to her parents out of love. Margaret, who had long believed Claire was alive somewhere in a spiritual community, accepted the children with bittersweet joy. She believed Claire was still out there, struggling maybe, but alive. She raised the children as her own grandchildren. She read the notes aloud. "Claire is safe," they said. "She wishes she could be with you, but this is best for now." Margaret never questioned them. Why would she? The handwriting was familiar. The story made sense. And Arthur, always steady, never gave her a reason to doubt. Inside the chamber, Claire was left with less and less. Her world was shrinking. Each child taken was a piece of her heart ripped away. But she didn't let the darkness consume her. She refused. For the children who remained with her, she became everything: a teacher, a mother, a protector. She invented games from scraps of cardboard, drew letters on the walls with chalk Arthur had once left behind. She made up songs, told stories, and crafted a routine to keep their minds active. When Arthur brought new books, she read them aloud. She tried to keep laughter alive, even when her own spirit felt empty. The children asked questions she couldn't answer. Why can't we go outside? What's the sun like? Do other kids live like this? She gave them soft, careful lies. She told them the world outside was sick, that they were safest here. That one day, maybe, they could go up. She didn't believe it herself, but she couldn't let them despair. Claire never saw a doctor. She learned to handle fevers with cold rags, cuts with bandages, coughs with patience. She became a nurse through necessity. She watched her children grow taller in a place where nothing else changed. The same walls, the same air, the same distant hum of pipes and Arthur's heavy footsteps above. There were moments when she broke. She would sit against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes staring at nothing. She would stop speaking for days. But then a child would cry, and she would rise. Because she had to. Arthur never brought toys. Never brought birthday gifts or surprises. If a child was good, he might nod once. If they were loud or disobedient, he would cut the lights for an entire day. Or refuse to bring food until silence returned. He ruled with absolute, cold logic. His visits became rituals. He would knock once on the steel door, enter with a blank face, set down supplies, and observe. Sometimes he would stay and watch them silently, his eyes scanning every movement. Claire taught the children not to speak when he was there. Not to look him in the eyes. Not to show fear. To the outside world, Arthur was the same man as always. Quiet, odd, maybe, but kind. He helped mow the lawn, shoveled snow, made small talk with neighbors. When people asked about the children, he said they were gifts, his daughter's last connection to the family. He spoke about Claire as if she were somewhere far away, sending children home like postcards. No one suspected the truth. No one could imagine what was happening just beneath their feet. And so the years passed. Unchanging. Oppressive. A life lived in silence, in stillness, in shadows. Claire waited. For something to shift. For a mistake. For a moment. And in time, it would come. But not yet. It began with a cough. At first, Claire didn't think much of it. In the underground chamber, small illnesses came and went often. With no clean air, no access to real medicine, and no sunlight, even a mild cold could stretch into weeks. But this cough didn't go away. It grew deeper, harsher. Then came the fever. The shivering. The labored breathing. 19-year-old Lena, one of Claire's oldest children still trapped underground, was getting worse by the hour. Claire tried everything she could. She used damp cloths to cool Lena's forehead, offered water, made broth from the sparse supplies Arthur provided. But Lena barely ate. She lay curled on the mattress, too weak to lift her head. Her skin turned pale, her lips dry and cracked. Her eyes, usually sharp and observant, became distant and dull. Claire had seen sickness before, but this was different. This was serious. She couldn't tell if it was pneumonia or something else. There were no thermometers, no antibiotics, no way to understand how bad it truly was. All she had was instinct, and her instincts told her they were running out of time. She begged Arthur for help. When he came down for his usual delivery, she fell to her knees, holding Lena's thin wrist in one hand and reaching toward him with the other. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "she's dying." Arthur looked at Lena without expression. He didn't respond. He turned, left the supplies on the floor, and walked out without a word. The steel door shut behind him. Hours passed. Then a full day. Lena's breathing became shallow. Her body trembled with every breath. Claire pressed her ear to her daughter's chest, hearing the crackling wheeze with each exhale. The panic inside her became unbearable. She held Lena close, whispering comfort, praying to a God she had long stopped believing in. The next day, Arthur returned. For the first time in years, Claire screamed at him. She slammed her fists against his chest, sobbed in front of him, cursed him, begged him. Her voice cracked from shouting. Her hands shook. "If you let her die," she said, "I will never forgive you." Something in Arthur shifted just slightly. He looked at Lena again, then back at Claire. Without speaking, he left the room. The next time the steel door opened, he was carrying a coat and a scarf. He threw them toward Claire. "Wrap her up," he said. Claire was stunned. "You're taking her?" Arthur didn't answer. He simply walked back into the hallway, leaving the door ajar for the first time in 24 years. Claire moved quickly. She dressed Lena carefully, wrapping her in the scarf, buttoning her coat. Lena barely responded, but her eyes opened once, just enough to meet Claire's. It was a moment of fragile hope, like the flicker of a candle in the dark. They emerged into the basement. The air felt different. Not fresh, but vast. The staircase to the first floor looked impossibly tall after so long underground. Claire clutched Lena's hand as Arthur led them silently through the house. It smelled like dust and old furniture. The wallpaper had changed. The furniture was different. Claire had not seen this world in over 2 decades, and now it felt like a dream, blurred, fragile, unreal. Arthur drove them to the hospital in silence. Lena lay across the back seat, barely conscious. Claire sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, afraid to blink. The world outside the car windows was a blur of color and light. Cars. People. Buildings. Trees. She didn't dare react. Not yet. At the hospital, Arthur walked straight to the emergency entrance. He carried Lena in his arms, telling the nurse at the desk that the girl had been left on their doorstep again. That she had been found unresponsive. That her mother was gone, and he didn't know where to find her. But the doctors were immediately suspicious. Lena's condition was alarming. Her body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. Her muscles were underdeveloped. Her skin was pale, sensitive to light. There were no medical records attached to her identity. No history. No vaccinations. No previous checkups. She spoke in a soft, cautious voice, often pausing mid-sentence to glance around the room. Her language was simple, almost childlike, despite her age. The doctors ran tests. The nurses asked questions. And very quickly, they called the police. Officers arrived at the hospital that same night. Arthur repeated the story he'd used for years, that Claire had joined a spiritual group, had abandoned her children, and that he had simply taken in the ones she couldn't raise. It had worked before. He had always seemed calm, composed, believable. But this time, something was different. The officers asked to speak with Lena again. They asked about her mother. Her home. Her siblings. Her memories. Lena tried to answer, but her responses raised more red flags than reassurance. She didn't know what a school looked like. She couldn't describe a playground. She wasn't sure what year it was. The officers pressed Arthur. They needed to speak with the girl's mother immediately. At first, Arthur resisted. Then he said she was close by, that he could go get her. Claire had been waiting in the car, heart pounding, staring at the automatic doors of the hospital. She didn't know what Arthur was saying inside. She didn't know if he would tell the truth, or if he'd try to send her back underground the moment Lena was admitted. But when the passenger door opened and Arthur motioned for her to come inside, she knew something had shifted. She stepped through the sliding doors. The fluorescent lights above her were overwhelming. The hospital was cold, sterile, humming with machines and distant voices. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and followed the nurse down the hallway. When the officers saw her, they recognized something immediately. Her skin was pale, nearly translucent. Her eyes darted with hesitation. She looked like a person who had not stood under the sun in decades. She didn't speak at first. She simply sat, hands folded, and stared at the floor. They asked her name. She said, "Claire." They asked if Lena was her daughter. She nodded. They asked where she had been for the last 24 years. For a long time, she said nothing. But then, something inside her broke. She began to speak. Slowly at first. Then faster. Her voice shook. Her hands trembled. But the words kept coming. She told them everything. The room. The door. The years. The children. The silence. The officers listened in stunned silence. A second team was dispatched to the house within the hour. They searched the basement and found the door. They opened it. Inside, they found a chamber. Just as Claire had described it. The low ceilings. The gray walls. The makeshift beds. The scraps of teaching material. The shelves of canned food. The children's drawings taped to the concrete. It had been there all along. Beneath their feet. And no one had known. The courthouse in Elm Ridge was small, aged, and never designed to hold the weight of something this big. The case of Arthur Bell transformed it from a forgotten building into the center of national attention. Satellite vans lined the nearby streets. Reporters stood at every entrance. Residents whispered among themselves in disbelief. The man they had known as quiet, reserved, perhaps a bit odd was now accused of one of the most shocking crimes in recent history. The trial began in early 2009, nearly a year after the discovery of the underground chamber. The charges were extensive: unlawful imprisonment, aggravated coercion, repeated physical and psychological harm, and the reckless endangerment of multiple minors. The prosecution had hundreds of pieces of evidence: photos of the chamber, expert testimony on its construction, medical records of the children, and Claire's detailed statement. But the most powerful element wasn't physical. It was the story itself. Claire Bell chose to testify behind closed doors. The trauma of her 24-year captivity was too severe to recount in a room full of strangers. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook as she spoke. Behind a privacy screen, she told the courtroom about the first day Arthur shut the door. About the silence. The loneliness. The cold concrete walls. The pregnancies. The children born without doctors, without light, without names written on any birth certificate. She described the moment her daughter fell ill, and how she begged the man who had stolen everything from her to let them out. And how, in that moment, something finally cracked. The courtroom was still. Even seasoned legal staff, used to tragic cases, struggled to hold composure. Her story was not just about confinement, it was about the theft of life, of identity, of freedom. And yet, woven through her account was something unexpected: resilience. Claire had taught her children to read. She had kept them safe. She had preserved some sliver of hope even when she had none for herself. Arthur Bell sat quietly through the proceedings. He rarely reacted. He didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say in his own defense, he replied only, "I did what I thought was right." Psychological evaluations offered further insight. Experts described him as deeply narcissistic, emotionally detached, and exhibiting traits consistent with a long-standing personality disorder. He saw no error in his actions, only misunderstandings. He believed, in his own twisted logic, that he had provided safety, education, and structure to the people he had imprisoned. He never expressed remorse. After 3 weeks of testimony, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Arthur Bell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the judge delivered the sentence. No applause. No cheers. Just a heavy silence that felt like closure. Arthur was transferred to a high-security facility designed for inmates requiring near-total isolation. His days became rigid, quiet, without access to the control he once held. The man who had stolen time from others was now confined by it. For Claire and her children, the next chapter was not a celebration. It was a beginning, and beginnings are rarely easy. They were moved to a new location under witness protection, their names changed, their past sealed behind layers of confidentiality. A small house was arranged for them far from Elm Ridge, far from any place that might trigger the memories they carried. Government assistance provided them with therapy, housing, and medical care. But no program, no matter how well funded, could erase 24 years spent in darkness. The children, now ranging from toddlers to young adults, faced a world they had never known. They were introduced to sunlight through small walks in the early morning, their eyes shielded with sunglasses and wide-brimmed hats. Some had never touched grass before. Others had never heard the chirping of birds or felt rain on their skin. Each experience was overwhelming. Even basic sounds, a doorbell, a siren, a dog barking, caused panic. Therapists worked daily with them to build emotional vocabulary. Many of the children had learned to communicate through fragments, through coded gestures and facial expressions. They didn't understand social rules. They struggled with things most people take for granted: standing in line, using utensils in public, even understanding what a week meant. Claire was patient. She had always been. But even she had moments of collapse. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, thinking she was still in the chamber. She flinched at the sound of heavy doors closing. She couldn't sleep without a light on. It would take years before she could sit in a room without checking every wall for a hidden door. But there were moments of progress too. Her youngest child, who had never seen the sky before the rescue, ran barefoot through a field for the first time and laughed so loudly that Claire wept. Another child, who had never used crayons before, drew a picture of a house with windows and a family standing in the sun. They didn't need perfect words. The joy was clear. The older children enrolled in basic education programs. It was difficult. They were behind in nearly everything, but they worked hard. They asked questions. They read books. They made friends, slowly. One of Claire's sons developed a talent for fixing electronics, perhaps inherited from the man he never wanted to mention. Another discovered a love for painting, using colors to express what words couldn't. Claire herself enrolled in counseling and later began writing. Not for publication, not for anyone else, just for herself. She kept journals filled with reflections, memories, even letters to the children she never got to raise. The children Arthur had taken upstairs and given away under false names. Claire had dreams of finding them someday, though legally it would be complicated. Her therapist told her healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means finding peace with remembering. Margaret Bell, Claire's mother, lived out her final years in a care facility. She was shielded from the full truth as much as possible, but she knew enough. The government decided it was best not to disclose everything. Claire never visited. She couldn't. The betrayal, however unintentional, was too deep. But she forgave her in silence. The town of Elm Ridge tried to move on. People painted over the past, literally and figuratively. The Bell House was eventually sold under a new name. The chamber was destroyed, filled in with concrete, sealed forever. No one wanted to remember what had been hidden there. But they never really forgot. Stories like that leave a mark. Years later, a reporter managed to contact Claire through legal channels. He asked if she would ever speak publicly. She declined. But she did offer one quote. "I lived in silence for 24 years, she said. Now, I just want to live in peace." And she meant it. There were no books, no interviews, no documentaries with her face. Claire chose a life out of the spotlight. But her story traveled anyway, not through tabloids, but through whispers, lectures, courtrooms. It became a cautionary tale, a study in power and isolation, a reminder of how much harm can hide in plain sight. And for every child who once knew only walls, there was now sky. They grew up, not unscarred, but strong. They didn't forget where they came from, but they no longer lived there. They lived forward. There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than any scream, when stillness carries more weight than chaos, and when the absence of light reveals not peace but horror. This case is one of those moments. It doesn't fit neatly into the boundaries of logic, and it leaves behind far more questions than answers. How can a person live side by side with others for decades, smile at neighbors, mow the lawn, and simultaneously harbor a secret so monstrous it defies belief? How can a home filled with ordinary furniture and family portraits contain, just beneath the surface, a reality so devastating, so meticulously hidden? What this case forces us to confront is the terrifying idea that not all dangers come from strangers. Sometimes, what we fear most is not what's unfamiliar but what is too familiar. A father. A husband. A quiet man with a steady job. Someone who offers no warning signs, who raises no alarms, but who slowly, over time, shapes a world that no one else can see. Arthur Bell didn't use violence in the way we typically imagine it. He used routine. He used quiet. He used planning. And most of all, he used power, soft, slow, and absolute. His greatest weapon was control, and he wielded it not with rage, but with calculation. He was not chaotic. He was deliberate. What stands out most, however, is not Arthur. It's Claire. The strength it takes to survive 24 years in captivity, to give birth in silence, to raise children in darkness, to protect them from a world they cannot even see. That strength cannot be taught. It cannot be explained. It can only be endured. Claire became more than a survivor. She became the one unshakable constant in her children's lives. She taught them to find joy where there was none, to imagine trees they'd never touched, to hope for sunlight they had never seen. She shielded them not just from the man outside the door, but from the despair that could have consumed them. And when the time came, she didn't hesitate. She told the truth not just for herself, but for all of them. Even now, years later, what happened beneath that house in Elm Ridge feels almost impossible. Not because of how shocking it is, but because of how easy it was to miss. The lawn was mowed. The lights were on. The mail was picked up. And beneath it all, a family lived and suffered, unseen. This case is a reminder that not every home is what it seems. That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it wears the face of someone we trust. And yet, it's also a story of resilience, of how even in the darkest corners, people can endure. They can resist. And, eventually, they can escape. Claire and her children will never get back the years that were taken from them. But they've built something new, however fragile, however hard won. They've stepped into the light not because they were saved, but because they refuse to stay buried. For those watching this story unfold, we ask you to look closer, not with suspicion, but with awareness. To pay attention to what lies beneath the surface. To listen when something feels off. Because the truth, even when hidden, finds its way forward, but it always helps when someone is there to see it. Thank you for staying with us through this haunting and powerful case. If it made you feel something: shock, anger, sadness, or even hope, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. We want to hear from you. And if you're drawn to stories like this, stories that uncover the hidden, the painful, the real, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Truth in Shadows for more true crime cases that reveal not just the crimes, but the human truths behind them. Because some stories need to be told, even the ones we wish weren't true.